It was just past dawn when I first noticed the letter. Pinned to the weathered wooden post by the entrance to my cabin with an oversized brass tack, it flapped gently in the mountain breeze like a surrender flag. I didn't see the black SUV. That must have delivered it. Didn't hear any knock or footsteps on the gravel path outside. Just the silent, smug arrival of bureaucracy. I stepped outside barefoot, mug of stale coffee in one hand, the other reaching for the paper as I narrowed my eyes at the bold HOA insignia stamped across the top. I already knew it would be trouble. Any envelope that pristine, on paper, that heavy and self-important meant something bad. And I was right. The letter, cold and clipped, declared that I had 72 hours to dismantle and remove my unauthorized structure, my cabin, the one I built myself, with my own hands, on land that had belonged to my grandfather and his father before him. The cabin wasn't just a house. It was a story carved in pine, a retreat built during my recovery from a messy divorce and the quieter heartbreak of a corporate job that had drained my soul drop by drop. Now they wanted it gone. The Heritage Pines HOA cited a newly enforced zoning ordinance that classified my structure as non-compliant due to its proximity to the protected woodland perimeter and because, get this, it lacked architectural cohesion with the community's aesthetic vision. I laughed aloud at that one. My nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the hill, and their own architectural cohesion included gaudy plastic flamingos and a fake wishing well. But that didn't matter to the HOA. They saw my cabin as an eyesore, an independent wrinkle, in their carefully ironed suburbia. I stood there, rereading the letter twice, rage slowly rising in my chest like sap in summer. They couldn't just make it disappear. Not without a fight. I spent the rest of that morning combing through deeds and titles, hunting for anything that might let me stand my ground. I'd inherited the land 2 years ago from my grandfather, who'd stubbornly resisted selling to developers his whole life. The property had remained technically outside the HOA's jurisdiction until a backroom annexation vote last fall, something I hadn't been informed of until this very letter arrived. And now, with that stealthy move, they'd tightened their grip. I felt betrayed, boxed in, and furious. I knew the HOA board by reputation. Retired types with too much time and too little empathy, obsessed with rules and regulations like they were sacred scripture. The president, Lenora Grist, was infamous for walking the neighborhood with a tape measure, reporting offenses down to the inch. Her idea of community was uniformity enforced with a sneer. My cabin represented everything she despised: independence, freedom, and the notion that beauty didn't require conformity. That night, as I sat under the stars, the weight of the deadline pressing against my chest like a boulder, I started to hatch a plan. A strange plan. A crazy one. But one that just might work. I remembered a conversation I'd had months ago with an old friend, Devin, who'd pivoted from real estate into commercial property law. He told me about a legal quirk. If you owned land with communal assets, like water systems, easements, or old utility rights, you could, under the right legal structure, lease access to those features back to the HOA at a fee. Most associations, he'd said, were lazy about their infrastructure records, and in cases where private ownership overlapped with communal use, it was possible to flip the table on them. Devin owed me a favor. I called him. We talked late into the night. By dawn, the plan was real. I was going to hit them where it hurt most, not with protest signs or appeals, but with paperwork and profit margins. I was going to turn my cabin into leverage, and I was going to make them pay, literally, for every square inch they tried to take from me. The next day, while Lenora and her board were likely sipping herb tea and polishing their compliance awards, I was at the county recorder's office, pulling every plat map, easement record, and historic zoning document I could find. It turned out that my grandfather had once installed a private well and a buried access road that, by a fluke of mapping, cut directly under the HOA's new clubhouse. That's right. their precious little colonial-style community center, the Pride of Heritage Pines, technically sat atop a stretch of land that was still deeded to my grandfather's estate. The paperwork had never been updated, the error never corrected. It was like finding gold in a dry creek bed. With Devon's help, I formed a tiny LLC and transferred ownership of that 12-foot wide strip of dirt road, plus the wellhead, into a commercial lease entity. I filed the paperwork with glee, and then, with precisely 48 hours remaining on my demolition deadline, I sent a letter of my own. It was short, simple, and sharp. Effective immediately, the Heritage Pines Homeowners Association would be assessed a monthly lease fee for continued access over and under the privately owned utility corridor that bisected their property. The fee was based on market value, commercial use, and the cost of retroactive compliance, tripled due to their unauthorized use over several years. Enclosed was an invoice. They had 30 days to remit payment. Failure to do so would result in a lien against the HOA's assets, beginning with the clubhouse. I signed it, sealed it in gold foil paper just to twist the knife, and had it hand-delivered by courier to Lenora's porch. The reaction was immediate. By the following morning, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Calls from unknown numbers, voicemails filled with frantic tones and poorly disguised threats. The HOA board demanded a meeting. I declined. They sent a compliance inspector to my cabin who left red tape on my fence post. I tore it down and stapled a copy of my invoice over it. The local paper caught wind and ran a front-page piece, with the headline, HOA Fights Resident Gets Rent Bill Instead. Suddenly, I wasn't just the villain in Lenora's eyes. I was a folk hero. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years stopped by to shake my hand. Some shared their own HOA horror stories. A few even asked if I could help them check their deeds. It was glorious, and it was only the beginning. I spent that week collecting rent like a landlord on a vengeance bender. Lenora and her board flailed, appealing to county officials, hiring their own lawyers, even offering to compromise if I agreed to demolish the cabin voluntarily. I refused. With each passing day, the pressure shifted from me to them. Their newsletter went from smug to panicked. The clubhouse was temporarily closed for repairs, a euphemism for we don't want to get sued. They tried to argue that my legal structure was malicious, but the courts didn't care about feelings. They cared about filings, and mine were airtight. The moment they annexed my land, they opened themselves to liability. And now they were paying for it. But it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the principle. These people thought they could muscle out the little guy, bulldoze character in the name of compliance. My cabin wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was defiance made manifest. Every plank said, I belong here and I'm not going anywhere. As the 72-hour deadline passed without demolition, I poured myself a drink on the porch and watched the sun set. I'd beat the clock. I'd flipped the script. And I wasn't done yet. There were still chapters to write, battles to fight, and more truths to expose. The HOA had declared war on my home, but now I was declaring war on the HOA. The board didn't take it lying down. If Chapter 1 of our war had been quiet papers and smirking legal filings, Chapter 2 was fire and fury, and it started with a drone. Not just any drone, either. This one had a sleek body, silent rotors, and a tiny camera that hovered no more than 10 feet above my porch early one morning as I sipped my coffee and read through the next round of invoices I was preparing to send to the HOA. At first, I thought it might be some nosy neighbor, maybe even one of the kids down the hill playing with new tech, but when I followed it with my binoculars, it didn't return to a backyard. No, it zipped off straight in the direction of the clubhouse, right where the HOA had been holding their hush-hush emergency meetings ever since I'd handed them their golden invoice. I knew then they were watching me, probably hoping I'd trip up, probably hoping they could catch something they could use, a zoning violation unauthorized utilities, anything that would let them go back on the defensive. But I wasn't stupid. I had expected this. What they didn't realize was that I'd spent the last few weeks not just protecting my land legally, but upgrading it physically. I'd worked in cybersecurity before the corporate burnout that led me here, and I still knew a few tricks. That drone didn't last more than 3 minutes before it got caught in my new signal scrambler's range. It faltered midair, spun wildly, and crash-landed in a thicket of pines. I retrieved it like a trophy, plucked out the SD card, and dropped the busted machine off at the HOA office inside a gift-wrapped box with a handwritten note, "Next time, knock." Their response, escalation. The HOA's lawyers filed a motion to fast-track an injunction against me, citing public nuisance and interference with community enjoyment. I laughed when I read it. The only thing I was interfering with was their unchecked arrogance. Still, Devin helped me prep for court. We spent late nights cross-referencing property lines, pulling emails, crafting a timeline of the board's annexation efforts, and documenting every sneaky move they'd made behind closed doors. I knew Lenora Grist would be there in person, likely in some hideous faux pearl necklace and pastel blazer, and sure enough, she arrived to the preliminary hearing with the full board in tow. 6 people who looked like they'd stepped off a retirement home brochure and into a Kafka novel. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with zero patience for theatrics, barely let Lenora finish her preamble before raising a hand. "You do understand," the judge said slowly, "that Mr. Harlan's LLC owns the land beneath your property's main utility line, correct?" Lenora sputtered. "That was an error in documentation. Yet you've been using it," the judge continued, "and you annexed his property before notifying him. Seems to me the defendant's actions are a response, not a provocation." Case dismissed, for now. But it wasn't just in court where the battle was brewing. The neighborhood had split into factions. On one side were the rule sticklers, emboldened by HOA propaganda and their own fear of change. On the other, a growing alliance of quietly furious residents who saw what I'd done as a beacon of resistance. Carol, who lived 3 houses down from the clubhouse, confessed to me in hushed tones that she'd been fined for having her wind chimes too loud. Another man, Jake, recently retired, stoic and tough as boot leather, had been threatened with eviction for having excessive tools in his garage. My story gave them something to rally around. Soon we were hosting backyard gatherings. Not protests, not quite, but discussions, strategy, research. People came with questions. Could they review their own deeds? Did they have legal claims against the HOA? Devin started coming up on weekends, walking folks through the basics. I watched as my small act of retaliation became the seed of a quiet rebellion. That's when Lenora made her boldest move yet. She claimed my cabin was a fire hazard, a threat to the forest, and petitioned the county to declare an emergency ordinance for immediate removal. This was no longer about zoning. She was trying to paint me as dangerous, irresponsible, a menace to public safety. The fire marshal was sent to inspect my place. He came with 2 deputies and a clipboard, expecting to find jerry-rigged wires and propane bombs. Instead, he found a state-of-the-art solar array, a Class A fire-resistant roof, and dual emergency egress routes. I'd spent the previous year overhauling everything. After all, this place was my legacy. He walked through twice and told me, almost apologetically, "You're the safest house in this whole valley." His report destroyed Lenora's latest angle, but she didn't stop. She never did. She started sending her minions door to door with flyers warning about fringe legal operators trying to destabilize the community. She called me a squatter in public meetings, a saboteur in neighborhood emails. At one point, she even hired a private investigator to dig into my past. He approached me at the gas station one afternoon, asking questions about my work history, my finances, even my divorce. I told him to tell Lenora she was wasting her money, but he grinned and said, She's not paying me, the board is. That's when I realized the full machine was now operating against me. They weren't just trying to remove my cabin anymore, they wanted to destroy me, personally, financially, socially. It was time to hit back harder. Devin and I began a full audit of the HOA's financial records, which, due to a community bylaws clause, were public domain. We found shady line items, consulting fees that had no documentation, sudden hikes in dues that didn't match service increases, and worst of all, evidence that Lenora's own landscaping company had been billing the HOA for phantom services. That was the crack we needed. I anonymously leaked the records to the local newspaper and followed it with a community open letter outlining every dirty deal in plain language. The fallout was nuclear. Residents showed up at the next board meeting in record numbers, demanding accountability. Lenora tried to deflect, but the walls were closing in. She'd overplayed her hand. By the end of the week, 2 board members resigned. One even emailed me privately to apologize, saying they hadn't realized how far things had gone. The pressure was mounting. The media was circling. The cabin was still standing, and now the HOA was teetering. But I knew better than to celebrate. Early. People like Lenora don't just disappear, they regroup, they retaliate. And sure enough, just as I started to breathe, I received a visit from a county code inspector. Unannounced, mid-afternoon, clipboard in hand, eyes already judging. Someone had reported that I was operating an unlicensed commercial enterprise on the property. He was there to confirm whether I was conducting public gatherings or unauthorized business. I knew exactly who'd made the call. I gave him a full tour. Again, nothing was out of order. No violations, no unpermitted activity. He left empty-handed, but the message was clear. Lenora was using every channel she could to keep me under siege. So I escalated again. I filed a civil suit, not for damages, but for declaratory relief. I wanted the court to officially recognize the HOA's unauthorized annexation as null and void. Devin helped prepare the paperwork, and we launched it with precision. The court date was set for 2 months out, and in the meantime, I continued to charge the HOA rent for the clubhouse, easement, and utilities. More residents joined my side. Carol found out her backyard technically included a stretch of land not covered by the HOA's jurisdiction. She started gardening again, defiantly. Jake reinstalled his old weather vane. People were waking up. I ended Chapter 2 the way I'd ended Chapter 1, on the porch of my cabin, drink in hand, watching the sun dip behind the trees. But this time, it wasn't just my fight. I saw fireflies in the dark, flickers of light in every direction. The war wasn't over, but I wasn't alone anymore. And soon, very soon, the empire Lenora had built on fear and fines would collapse under the weight of its own hypocrisy. All I had to do was hold the line. The courthouse hallway smelled like floor wax and stale anxiety the morning we walked in for the declaratory relief hearing, and I could feel the eyes on me from every direction. Lenora Grist, standing near the door with her perfectly lacquered smile cracked just enough to reveal the tension underneath, flanked by 2 freshly hired attorneys in stiff gray suits who looked like they specialized in burying problems, not solving them. I didn't flinch. I walked in calm, confident, wearing boots caked in honest dirt and a jacket older than Lenora's HOA presidency. Devin was beside me, briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other, already thinking 10 steps ahead as we made our way into the chamber and took our seats. The judge entered, a different one this time, older, keener, the kind of man who'd seen 100 petty feuds and could smell manipulation like blood in the water. And as the gavel hit the bench, I knew this was the day it would all start, to fall apart for them. We presented the records first. Documents showing the original deed, the boundary lines, the quiet annexation vote that had taken place without the required public notice, the surveyor's report that placed my cabin entirely outside the HOA's historical boundary prior to the vote. Then came the invoices, the registered LLC filings, the notices I had sent to the HOA before billing them rent, everything by the book, everything clean. Their lawyers tried to argue that I had weaponized technicalities, but the judge interrupted. "So, you admit he followed the law?" They sputtered. Lenora stayed silent. I watched her grip the table edge until her knuckles turned white. The ruling didn't come that day. It never does. But I could feel the momentum shift. Word spread through the neighborhood fast, faster than wildfire, and the next week, something happened that nobody expected. One of Lenora's former allies, a man named George Milburn, published a full-page letter in the HOA newsletter denouncing the board. He confessed that Lenora had pushed through several votes without quorum, that she'd manipulated procedural language to silence dissent, and that she'd personally profited from maintenance contracts for years. The newsletter was supposed to be reviewed before publication, but he'd printed it himself and stuffed it into every mailbox before anyone could stop him. It was a bombshell. That evening, a dozen neighbors showed up at my cabin with coolers and folding chairs. Not a protest, not a meeting, just people wanting to say, "We're with you." Jake grilled burgers. Carol brought homemade lemonade. Devin showed up with a Bluetooth speaker and some old rock vinyls he'd digitized. We laughed around the fire pit like it was summer camp, but I could see in everyone's faces the hunger for more. They didn't just want Lenora out. They wanted change. They wanted the entire foundation of the HOA reevaluated, rewritten, and they wanted me to lead it. I didn't say yes, not yet. I wasn't a politician or an organizer. I was a man who'd built a cabin and refused to be bullied. But still, the idea rooted itself somewhere deep. Over the next few days, I started, helping other residents dig into their property documents, identifying overlaps, inconsistencies, ancient rights of way that had never been fully transferred. We found an old irrigation easement running under a cul-de-sac that gave one homeowner the right to charge for maintenance disruption. We found that the HOA had illegally installed fencing across a native plant preserve without county approval. We found, most damningly, that the board had used dues to fund a private security firm that harassed teenagers and delivered weekly behavioral reports to Lenora's inbox. The more we uncovered, the uglier it got. I compiled it all into a master report and sent it anonymously to the county commissioner, the planning department, and the local news outlet that had covered my story before. Within days, reporters were showing up at Lenora's door, cameras rolling, asking questions she couldn't answer. She stopped appearing in public. She missed a board meeting, then another. And yet, the attacks on me didn't stop. One night, I came home from a grocery run to find my gate torn off its hinges and spray paint scrawled across my cabin wall. "Get out!" I didn't call the cops. What would they do? Instead, I cleaned it off, repaired the gate, and installed motion, lights and a trail camera. 2 nights later, I caught footage of a man in a ski mask trying to slash the tires on my truck. He didn't get far. I let the dogs out and he bolted. I never saw his face, but I had my suspicions. I sent the footage to the board anonymously, with a note, "I don't scare easy." Then I doubled the rent on the easement. That hit harder than any punch ever could. By now, the HOA was hemorrhaging funds. Several members stopped paying dues in protest. The clubhouse utilities were temporarily cut due to a missed lease payment. Residents found themselves holding yoga classes in garages, meetings in driveways. Every day they didn't pay was interest accrued. I knew I was pushing them into collapse. I also knew they'd try one last desperate move, and I was right. Lenora returned with a vengeance. She called a special community tribunal, a rarely used clause in the bylaws that allowed the HOA to expel a homeowner via a supermajority vote for conduct detrimental to neighborhood unity. It was pure theater. She papered the neighborhood with flyers about rogue elements and agitators spreading misinformation. But this time, people saw through it. On the night of the vote, over 100 residents gathered at the clubhouse, every seat filled, hallway crowded, windows open to let the sound out. I stood in the back, arms crossed, as Lenora made her grand case with PowerPoint slides and pie charts. Then the rebuttals began. Carol stood up first, soft-voiced but steel-backed, recounting her own harassment. Then Jake, who called Lenora a tyrant to her face. Then George, who offered to show financial records that backed up his accusations. One by one, people stood, not just for me but for themselves. The vote wasn't even close. 93% opposed expulsion. Lenora's face twisted into something between disbelief and rage. Then she made her mistake. She screamed. Right there in front of everyone. She screamed that the community was ungrateful, that she had protected them from themselves, that nobody understood what it took to maintain order. The room went silent. One of the board members slowly slid off his name tag and walked out. Another followed. And just like that, the foundation cracked wide open. I stood up and walked. To the front, not to gloat, but because I knew the crowd needed someone to steady the moment. This neighborhood doesn't need a queen, I said. It needs a community. And communities aren't built on rules. They're built on trust. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in quiet, determined nods. The next day, Lenora resigned. Not just from the board, from the neighborhood. Her house was listed within the week. I heard she moved to Arizona. Some said she joined a stricter HOA there. Others joked that she founded one. It didn't matter. She was gone. And the board? Dissolved. Temporarily, at least. A new committee was formed to draft fresh bylaws, ones that valued fairness over fear. I declined the offer to chair it, but I agreed to serve as a consultant, especially on the legal side. Devin stayed involved, too, helping rewrite everything from the dues structure to the complaint process. It wasn't about punishing the old system anymore. It was about building something better. As for my cabin, it stood taller than ever, not just physically, but symbolically. I painted over the spray paint scars and added a carved sign above the porch. Home, no permission required. People stopped by often now, not to complain, but to talk, to ask advice, to share. We'd started something bigger than retaliation. We'd started a movement, and though the war was over, I knew there was still work to be done. Some neighbors in nearby communities were facing similar fights. They reached out, and I answered. Because when someone tries to bulldoze your freedom, your history, your home, you don't just stand there, you build, you resist, you lead. It began with silence, a kind I hadn't known in months. No drone buzz, no threats taped to my gate, no meetings echoing with raised voices over property lines and bylaws. Just the hum of cicadas, the creak of pine in the wind, the whisper of peace rolling through the trees like a long-awaited breeze. I'd survived the war. The cabin still stood, stubborn as ever, and for the first time since the HOA's first 72-hour ultimatum, I wasn't waking up with a new lawsuit in my inbox or a passive-aggressive note under my windshield. But survival wasn't the end. It was the start of something bigger. The neighborhood was changing, and now everyone was watching to see what would grow in the crater where the old regime had collapsed. I wasn't leading the new board, but I was the ghost in the wiring, the voice they called when they hit a wall, the hand they reached for when the ink on new ideas began to dry. I'd helped draft a new charter, one that ensured transparency, capped the board's authority, limited dues, and required all financial decisions to be made through open, verifiable voting. I pushed for term limits and got them. I demanded full digital access to all meetings for residents and helped set up the live streaming system. In a place once ruled by secrecy and whispered threats, we now had sunlight and open windows. And for a community once built on fear, that light was blinding and beautiful. But change has gravity, and when you shift the balance of one place, others start to tilt. I began receiving emails, first a few, then dozens, from people across the country who'd read about my story after the local newspaper's series went viral. There were teachers in Texas, retirees in Florida, young couples in California, all of them fighting their own HOA nightmares. Some had lost their homes to technicalities. Others had been fined into foreclosure over mailbox colors or garden statues. One woman in Colorado said she'd been threatened with legal action for building a wheelchair ramp for her disabled husband. I couldn't ignore them. I started compiling the stories, turning them into a kind of archive, a map of modern land feudalism. Devin helped me set up a nonprofit, Landline Defense. We offered legal resources, document templates, media kits, and a public directory of HOA abuse cases. Within months, we had chapters in 10 states. We weren't just pushing back anymore, we were teaching others how to push too. Back home, the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm. Carol planted a pollinator garden that now bloomed with wild color every spring. Jake started a community tool library out of his garage. The new board hosted open-air barbecues instead of closed-door hearings. The clubhouse, once the seat of petty tyranny, became a place for workshops, potlucks, even a small book exchange. Kids roller skated on the tennis courts without fear of citations. And every time I walked down the trail to the mailbox or waved to a neighbor mowing their lawn, I remembered what almost happened, what had nearly been lost, and how close we had come to becoming just another place where power sat quietly atop fear. But not here, not anymore. The rent payments from the HOA continued for a while, but eventually we negotiated a full easement purchase, not out of pressure, but principle. I let them buy back the utility rights at fair market value, the money going straight into the Community Improvement Fund. I didn't need it. The cabin had become its own kind of wealth, a place that gave back not through profit, but through meaning. People started calling it the outpost. It became a symbol of resistance, not the paranoid, prepper kind, but the rational kind. The kind that grows from knowing where you stand and refusing to be moved by anything but truth. I began hosting seminars twice a year, inviting community leaders, legal scholars, and residents from other neighborhoods to come, share, learn, plan. We had tents, projectors, even bonfires where we'd sit late into the night trading stories of how we'd all once been pushed too far and finally pushed back. These weren't just meetings. They were blueprints for better communities, for real ones. And yet, despite all the success, there were quiet days too, days when I sat on the porch alone, the wind still, my dog curled at my feet, and wondered what would have happened if I'd caved. If I'd packed up when they gave me 72 hours, if I'd sold, folded, walked away. Those thoughts never stayed long, but they came. And every time, I was grateful I hadn't. Not because I'd won, but because I'd found the line I wouldn't cross. We all have one, even if we don't know it yet. Mine just happened to be a crooked boundary line drawn by a careless HOA trying to erase a man's home. And once I found it, I stood on it with everything I had. That line had given me purpose, not just for myself, but for the hundreds, thousands who now saw their own lines more clearly. One spring morning, 2 years after the final vote that removed Lenora, I received a letter in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten. You were right. I let it all get away from me. I hope you're still building. No name. But I didn't need one. I folded it, tucked it into a drawer in the cabin, and said nothing. Sometimes closure doesn't come with trumpets. Sometimes it comes in a few pen strokes and silence. So here I am, still in the cabin, still walking the land, still answering emails from strangers who've become allies. The HOA is now a cooperative association, fully voluntary, funded not by fines but by actual choice. Membership has grown, not shrunk. Turns out when you lead with trust, people want to be part of something. The fences around yards are still there, but the invisible ones, the ones built out of control, fear, and intimidation, those are gone. Replaced by paths, by welcome mats, by porch lights left on in case someone gets lost in the dark. You don't win against a machine by becoming one. You win by being stubborn, human, whole. You win by building something they can't tear down, with threats. When they gave me 72 hours to demolish my cabin, they thought I'd surrender. What they didn't realize is that you can't bulldoze history. You can't evict resilience. And you sure as hell can't scare a builder off his own land. So if you ever find yourself standing at your own line, facing down suits, fines, bureaucracy, or anyone trying to rip out your roots, remember this. Don't blink. Don't run. Build taller. Stand louder. And if they try to triple your pain, triple their rent. Then teach your neighbors to do the same.